Well, I'd like to dedicate the panel this morning to the memory of Oriana Fallaci. Last November, the Center was privileged to honor Oriana with the Annie Taylor Award. And this is an award conferred on individuals who show exceptional courage at great odds and in the face of great danger. And Oriana had said that she was delighted to receive an award that was inspired by a woman who jumped over the Niagara Falls in a barrel and survived. She thought it was 1,000 times more precious and prestigious and infinitely more ethical than receiving a Nobel Prize or an Oscar. She also said in her characteristic way that the award overestimated her guts and that it was jumping over Niagara Falls was far more dangerous than writing about the truth. It was her last public appearance. Serge Trivkovic said that Oriana was an outstanding defender of our culture and civilization against the barbarity from without and the betrayal from within. Oriana was a fierce critic of jihadism, an outspoken opponent of Muslim immigration into Europe, and she felt that Europe had already become Eurabia, or a colony of Islam. Oriana was a great admirer of David Horowitz, as she called him, and Daniel Pipes, as well as our first panelist, Robert Spencer.
The most common understanding of Europe in relation to Islam is that there was no trouble at all until the Crusades, at which time the Europeans attacked the Islamic world, unprovoked, uncalled for, imperialistic, proto-colonialist, and this was the beginning of centuries of hostility that continue to this day. Bill Clinton has subscribed to this view, as well as many others. Unfortunately, however, it's not historically accurate to say that the Crusades were the first encounter of the Islamic world with Europe, or Europe with the Islamic world. The first encounter of Europe with the Islamic world came much earlier. As a matter of fact, it came from Muhammad, the prophet of Islam himself, when he wrote to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, and he told him to embrace Islam, and that if he and his dominions, if his subjects embraced Islam, then their lives and their property would be safe. In other words, the implicit threat was that if they did not embrace Islam, then their lives and their property would not be safe. And indeed, they weren't. Muhammad himself, before the end of his life, the last battle that he undertook was not actually specifically a battle at all. It was an attempt at a battle. He rode in the heat of summer in Arabia to the Byzantine holdings in northwestern Arabia, bordering on Syria, and he tried to engage the Byzantine army there, but the Byzantines withdrew. However, at that point he received, or shortly thereafter, the revelation from Allah of the 9th chapter of the Quran, which stands as the Quran's last word, according to mainstream Muslim theologians, on jihad and the relationship of believers to non-believers, and which is the most bellicose and violent of all the chapters of the Quran, stipulating that Muslims must wage war even against Jews and Christians until they either convert to Islam or submit as inferiors under Islamic rule, with all kinds of legal regulations in place designed to ensure that they feel themselves subdued. Muslim warriors took this very seriously from the beginning, and shortly after Muhammad's death in 632, began to chip away at the Byzantine holdings in North Africa and the Middle East, forming what is now, by conquest, now known as the heart of the Islamic world. And fairly soon, very soon, really, they swept into Europe. Only 16 years after Muhammad's death, in the year 648, they originally laid siege to Constantinople itself. That siege failed, as did a second siege of Constantinople in 717. It wasn't until May 29th, 1453, Black Tuesday, that Constantinople actually fell to the jihad armies. But that was unfortunately neither the beginning nor the end of the jihadist advance into Europe. Spain, of course, conquered by jihad armies coming up the other way through North Africa, invaded in 711 and conquered by 715, was held until 1492, as most people know. There were then attempts to conquer France, stopped by Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, at the Battle of Tours in 732. There were subsequent attempts to invade and conquer France in 792 and 848. Both failed. However, the jihad armies did occupy Sicily and southern Italy for quite some time, beginning in the 9th century. Rome was threatened by them in the year 846. And an intriguing historical parallel, the Pope agreed to pay tribute to the jihad armies in return for peace. In the year 1071, in the Battle of Manzikert in the east in Anatolia, Byzantine power was decisively broken and the road was opened, although it took quite some time after that. The road was opened for the jihadist advance into Europe to continue relatively unimpeded. It was interrupted shortly thereafter, however, at the request of the Byzantine emperor, who sent word to the West and to the Pope asking for help. This resulted in the First Crusade. The Crusades were thus not an act of unprovoked aggression. They were a response to centuries of uninterrupted aggression from the Islamic world that had gone relatively unchallenged. The Crusaders certainly did some things that cannot be excused, particularly when they targeted Jews, when unfortunately they would have been much wiser, and it would have changed history in numerous positive ways had they made alliance with them as groups that were both threatened by the jihadist onslaught and fought on that basis. But in any case, the Crusades interrupted the jihad advance into Europe for 200 years, but they did not end it. The conquest of Constantinople took place after that, also followed by further advances into Eastern Europe and ultimately to Vienna. That far into the Central Europe, when on September 11, 1683, the siege of Vienna was broken, and that was the high watermark of the advance of the jihad into Europe until modern times. Now, there are many things about this subject that, like the shadow, have the power to cloud men's minds. And one of them is the fact that the jihad advance into Europe did end in 1683. And then we didn't see, at least on that largest scale, jihad warfare until relatively recently, until the last few decades of the 20th century. Many people believe that at that point, this was because of some kind of a reformation in the Islamic world that led to the discarding of the ideology that had fueled these conquests to begin with. That ideology was based on the teachings of the Quran and on the directions of Muhammad the Prophet, who said that the Muslims must beat the unbelievers in battle, offer them conversion to Islam. If they refused conversion, then to offer them second-class status under the rule of the Islamic State. If they refused both, then to go to war with them. This was the ideology that fueled the conquests, based on the assumption that it was part of the responsibility of the Muslim community, the Ummah, to wage war in order to establish the hegemony of the Islamic social order over the world. Now here again, this is another thing that clouds men's minds. Islam was not spread by the sword in the sense that most people understand the term. People think that these armies swept into North Africa and the Middle East and up into Europe, and they forced people to convert. They did not. They subjugated them as dhimmis. They made them second-class citizens. They weren't actually, strictly speaking, citizens at all. And they enforced various institutionalized stipulations of discrimination against them, which were so onerous, particularly the tax, the jizya, that they had to pay, from which Muslims were exempt, that conversions became the only pathway to a better life for these people. And so there were conversions that would result, but they were not, strictly speaking, forced. The wars were designed to establish the hegemony of Islamic law. As Maududi, the great Pakistani Muslim theorist of the 20th century, put it, non-Muslims have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, it is the responsibility of Muslims to do whatever is necessary to dislodge them from that power. Now, what happened then? In 1683, it became simply impossible for this jihad to be pursued because of the weakness of the Ottoman Empire and the decline in strength generally of the Islamic civilization. It was not a matter of setting aside these doctrines, it was only a matter of not being strong enough to pursue them. Now, of course, in our own age, because of the Khomeini revolution in Iran, because of Saudi oil billions, it has again become possible to take up this war again. And so people believe, because we have not seen this to such a scale, on such a scale until the last few decades, that it is something newly minted. It is not. It is something radically traditional. It is something that is very old, deeply rooted within the Islamic religion, and that is being reasserted today. Now, of course, today what is happening in Europe is very different. There are no invading armies. There is just a demographic revolution. Today, there are several countries, notably Holland, France, and Germany, where the non-Muslim population is either not growing at all or actively declining, and the Muslim population is growing so rapidly that probably by mid-century or shortly thereafter there will be Islamic majorities in those countries, unless something drastically changes. And then, because of the political imperatives that are inherent within Islam, and have been from the beginning, there will be calls in those states and others in Europe to establish Islamic law there. Sheikh Qaradawi, who is well known as one of the most influential Islamic teachers in the world, he has been hailed as a moderate leader by the mayor of London, as well as by John Esposito, the scholar of Islam at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. Here is a quote from Qaradawi that I think is very important to keep in mind as a backdrop to understanding what's happening in Europe today. Qaradawi said, "The Prophet Muhammad was asked, 'What city will be conquered first, Constantinople or Rome?' He answered, 'The city of Heraclius will be conquered first, that is Constantinople.' The city of Heraclius was conquered in 1453. Rome remains, and we hope and believe that it too will be conquered. This means that Islam will return to Europe as a conqueror and victor, after being expelled from it twice, once from the south, from Andalusia, and a second time from the east, when it knocked several times on the door of Athens." I'm not quite sure what he means by that, because actually they did conquer Athens, they just didn't Islamize the population. Anyway, Qaradawi continues, "I maintain that this conquest this time will not be by the sword, but by preaching and ideology. Islam will return to Europe, and the Europeans will convert to Islam. Then they themselves will be able to be the ones to disseminate Islam to the world more than the ancient Muslims." That last sentence may be the most important thing he said. I mean, obviously he's reaffirmed an imperialism, an expansionism. He's quite forthright about it, even though, paradoxically enough, no Western leaders have yet acknowledged that this imperialism exists. But in any case, at the end he says, "Then they themselves will be able to be the ones to disseminate Islam to the world, more than the ancient Muslims." So he is envisioning an Islamic Europe that will disseminate Islam to the world. Now imagine the position of the United States in a situation in which you have Islamic states in Europe. What will be the state of our alliances and our ability to act in the world? This will be the means by which he will be the Islamic empire that Qaradawi envisions in Europe will be able to extend power over the United States as well and neutralize American power in the world once and for all. The demographic trends in the United States are not nearly as dire as they are in Europe, and the Islamization of the United States is something that is more or less in the realm of fantasy rather than a terrible and verging reality as it is in Europe. But nonetheless, if he succeeds in Europe, and those who believe as he does succeed in Europe, then the United States will be gravely in peril. And that is what I believe he was referring to when he says, then they themselves will be able to be the ones to disseminate Islam to the world, because they will be able to overcome their foremost obstacle to that dissemination, the United States. Finally, Muqtada Khan of the Center for Islam and Democracy recently noted that Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, when speaking about the Battle of Tours in 732, had said that if the Franks had not won the Battle of Tours, then the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and their pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Muhammad. So Gibbon. Muqtadar Khan says that he reflected on this while sitting in a coffee shop in Oxford looking at the splendid domes and tall minarets of the two large mosques that have recently been built there. And that he says this: Gibbon would have been surprised to learn the lesson that military defeats do not stop the advance of civilizations, and the globalization of Islam is unimpeded by the material and military weakness of the Muslim world. I would suggest that it is a vital question for the survival of our own nation and our own civilization that we consider his words very carefully in all their implications and act accordingly. Thank you.
Recently, as we all know, Britain's domestic intelligence agency, the MI5, admitted that it's tracking some 200 Islamist cells with over 1,600 members who are actively engaged in plotting or facilitating terrorist attacks in the UK and overseas. 14,000 British Muslims are considered to be potential terrorists by MI5. According to the UK government statistics, and these usually weigh in on the side of being conservative, there are 1 million Muslims in London, 50% of them under the age of 25. In a Times of London poll conducted this past July, and that's 1 year since the London tube bombings, 2%, or 20,000, stated that they would be proud if a family member joined Al-Qaeda. 16%, 160,000, said they would be indifferent. According to another poll, 60% of British Muslims want to live under Sharia law in the UK. 20% admitted that they felt sympathy for the London tube bombers. Ironically, 4 days after the London attacks, the House of Commons passed a religious hate law aimed at protecting Muslims. They were under a lot of pressure from Islamic organizations to do something to protect Muslims who perceived a greater threat to themselves since 9/11. Well, here today to tell us about the fifth column in Britain and how they're advancing the global jihad and threatening the once special relationship between the UK and America is Melanie Phillips.
I'm happy to say that I think I'm in the running for this year's awards, and I'm really holding my breath. I'm going to speak to you today about Britain. Britain is basically caught in a pincer movement between the two arms of the global jihad, the terrorist arm and the cultural arm. Britain is only now, even after 9/11, even after the 7/7 bombings in July 2005, only now slowly actually waking up to the fact that it has a terrorist threat of the scale and the nature that it does, but it is still in a state of confusion over the cultural threat. You may have read or heard of our debate recently in Britain over the niqab, the wearing of the full-face veil by Muslim women. And the remarkable thing about this debate was that it occurred at all, and that it occurred with such ferocity and passion. It was as if a dam had burst, because for all these years Britons have been told that they cannot discuss Islamic practices and criticize them for fear of being labeled Islamophobic, prejudiced against religion. So that was a good development. I had some queries myself about precisely how that debate was conducted, but basically the fact the debate was held was a very positive development. On the other hand, we also had very recently the trial of Nick Griffin, who is the leader of Britain's most racist and nearest thing we have to a neo-fascist party, the British National Party. Griffin was not on trial for his fascist ideas. He was on trial for inciting racial hatred by saying Islam was a wicked religion. Some conceptual confusion there. The jury didn't buy it. The jury will have no truck with people being prosecuted for saying Islam is a wicked religion because the jury probably agrees with this. So the jury slung out the prosecution and Griffin was acquitted. The disturbing thing was, not only this prosecution was brought, but the disturbing thing was that our current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, who is the man most likely to succeed Tony Blair as Prime Minister, as leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister, said that he proposed to strengthen the law to make sure that anyone who said Islam was a religion, was a wicked religion, would be prosecuted successfully and convicted. In other words, reviving this great debate which Janet's referred to that we had about criminalising the incitement to religious hatred, which basically boils down to saying that if somebody like me says that there is such a thing as Islamic terrorism, I can be called I can be accused of inciting religious hatred. So this is troubling, to put it mildly, and it means that we still have a climate of denial. This is Britain, where in the 1990s, remarkable as this may seem, Britain became the most significant hub for al-Qaeda terror in Europe, mainly because of its state of denial about the Islamist threat. Well, we now accept that there is an Islamic threat, as we've heard from Janet, these terrifying figures about the numbers who are currently under suspicion in Britain's 2 million strong or so Muslim community out of a population, to put it in context, of some 60 million souls. So we accept in Britain that there is a terrorist threat of considerable size. We won't accept, however, what the cause is. We find all sorts of excuses still for the cause of the fact that we have all these young Muslims who are born and bred in Britain but are turning into people who wish to murder large numbers of their fellow British citizens. And we say the reason for that is because of Islamophobia. The reason for that is because of discrimination. The reason for that is because of poverty. The reason for that is because, above all, we have supported America in the war in Iraq. What we won't accept is that this is, which I think is personally demonstrably true, we are in the throes of a global religious war designed to Islamicize those parts of the world which are not already Islamic. We don't realize in Britain that our British Muslims have been radicalized by British institutions set up by the Muslim community as far back as the 1980s. These institutions were set up by people who had come in from Pakistan. We didn't realize that Pakistan had already been radicalized to the Jihad by Saudi Wahhabism. Therefore, these institutions, these Muslim institutions, educational institutions, cultural institutions set up in the 1980s were actually preaching Wahhabism, were preaching hatred of the West, and a whole generation and subsequent generations of young Muslims have been born and bred into this society which has radicalized them to hatred of the West. We don't realize in Britain the scale of the Muslim Brotherhood program to Islamize Europe. We have no idea. There's virtually no discussion of this whatsoever. People in Britain are almost entirely unaware, for example, that in 1978 the Organization of the Islamic Conference in London decided to set up institutions in Britain financed by Muslim states around the world to lobby for recognition of Islam as a separate religious entity, in other words, Sharia law, and this was one step towards the full politicized, towards the full political program of the Islamization of Britain. We think in Britain that the problem is that our Muslims don't feel properly British. Have we got this wrong? They feel so British, they really do feel British. They feel so British, they think that Britain should become Islamic. That is the problem, and we simply have got this the wrong way around. And that is because in Britain we are incapable of seeing the world through anything other than our own eyes. It is an example of liberal hubris. We can only see the world through the liberal prism. We cannot see the world through the prism of people who really do not come from that tradition whatsoever. We cannot understand in Britain the perspective of people whose worldview is answerable not to reason, not to the rule of facts, but to irrationality, prejudice, and bigotry. Now, I have to say there are many truly moderate Muslims in Britain. This is a controversial thing to say, I know in some circles, but I believe it to be true, and I'll define what I mean in a moment. But there is nevertheless a huge number who are not, and as we heard just from Janet, the numbers who believe, for example, in the primacy of Sharia law and so on. The problem we have in Britain is that our establishment has effectively redefined what it is to be a moderate Muslim. I believe there are moderate Muslims, but our establishment says that the majority are moderate, and they mean something quite different. What do they mean? By a moderate Muslim, they mean a Muslim who does not intend or support or will promote the murder of fellow Britons. That's it. If you are a Muslim who supports the jihad across the world, if you are a Muslim who supports the fight against the coalition in Iraq, who supports suicide bombings in Israel, that doesn't make you any less a moderate, because that's just resistance. So we have the phenomenon of our establishment believing that Sheikh Qaradawi, of whom you've just heard from Robert, the man who says it's a religious duty to commit suicide bombings in Israel and to blow up the coalition forces in Iraq, Sheikh Qaradawi is regarded, or has been regarded until now by our British political and security establishment, as not simply a moderate, but actually as a role model. Why? Because Sheikh Qaradawi says it's a tactical error for Al-Qaeda to blow up Britain. Therefore, he's a man with whom we can do business. This is what the British call pragmatism. You might have a rather different word for it. So we've heard about the extreme views of Muslims, and I can add to that, just to make you even more aware of what problem we have. Nearly half think that 9/11 was a conspiracy between the United States and Israel. 46% think the Jewish community is in league with the Freemasons to control the media and politics. And 37% of British Muslims believe that the Jewish community in Britain is a legitimate target as part of the ongoing struggle for justice in the Middle East. Personally, I see the problem as this. We have a kind of continuum of extremism. If you think of a continuum as a line, on the far edge of the line are the people who want to blow us up. Behind them is a slightly larger number of people who are supporting them. In total, they are a small proportion of the British Muslim community. In absolute terms, they're a terrifying number, but in proportion of the Muslim community in Britain, they're a very small number. The vast majority would not go there. However, that does not mean the vast majority are moderate. On the contrary. Among the people on the continuum, the vast majority who would not go down the road of terrorism or violence are people who believe variously or together the following precepts: that Islam is a that the West is a conspiracy to destroy Islam, run by America; that the Jews are the puppet masters of the West; that we should live under Sharia; that the Muslims should live under Sharia law; that Israel is an illegitimate state founded by European Jews being plonked in the middle of a country called Palestine, which was historically the country of Muslims and Arabs. Now, instead of facing this down, this mindset of error and propaganda and lies and hatred, our political and security establishment has been instinctively an appeaser. It believes, fundamentally, the problem is this: it believes that all terrorism across the world, and Islamist terrorism is no different. It believes that all terrorism is rooted in discrete, identifiable geopolitical grievances. Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, Bosnia, cause of choice, but basically terrorism is linked to those things. And therefore the way you deal with Islamist terror, which is driven by all these things, is to solve the grievances. So thus we have our Prime Minister committing the absolute folly, which he's believed for many, many years, that if you solve Israel-Palestine, you diffuse Muslim terror, because you kind of draw the sting of Muslim rage. And in my view, it's completely the other way around. You can only solve the Israel impasse as you can only solve the war in Iraq and other conflicts around the world in which Islamists are involved, if first of all, you destroy Islamist terror. And it's that way around, not the other way around. However, our establishment doesn't get this, and as a result it's had a strategy to combat Islamist terrorism in Britain by tackling what it calls the underlying causes, which it defines as our foreign policy, discrimination, poverty, Islamophobia, and all the rest of it. So we now have, for example, Sharia-compliant mortgages, a great advance. We have a government which put a toe in the water some time ago and said we must stop forced marriages. I mean, 14-year-old girls being basically taken to Pakistan and elsewhere to form marriages is an abomination to us. We all agree, but they've now withdrawn from that. We're not going to have any legislation to stop this because in case it offends the Muslim community. And perhaps most remarkably of all, we have our police talking now about making their own intelligence on terrorism available to certain selected representatives of the Muslim community before the police undertake any terrorist raids in order to get their approval and consent. We have brought radical Muslims into the very heart of government as advisors, people who subscribe to the tenets of the Muslim Brotherhood, to Hizb ut-Tahrir, and we have allowed, or are allowing, an enormous mosque to be the largest mosque in Europe, apparently, seating some, 40 to 70,000 people, to be built on the site of the Freudian slip, of the Olympic Village, so that when Britain hosts the Olympics in 2012, next to the Olympic Stadium, when people come to see what Britain has on display as its great sort of cultural excitement, and this is what Britain's all about, next to the Olympic Stadium will be a mosque, the largest mosque in Europe. What a statement that will be. Worse still, this mosque is being funded by the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat is said by the FBI and French intelligence to be the antechamber to Al-Qaeda and the most significant recruiters to Al-Qaeda in Europe. There is virtually no discussion about this in Britain. No planning authorities have raised an eyebrow. There have been no members of parliament leaping up and down. The government is silent. That's the problem. Why have we got this problem? Well, I've written a whole book about this, and I've only got about 3 seconds left, so I will make it brief. The fundamental problem is that in Britain, we've simply lost the national plot. For the last 3-4 decades, we've been hollowing out the whole notion of British national identity and values, which have created a kind of vacuum into which radical Islam has seen its opportunity and poured in. Britain has quite simply, and I'm talking about the elites, not about the people. There is a great gulf now in Britain between leaders and led. But among the elites, the political elite, we have lost belief in ourselves as a nation, and indeed in the idea of the nation itself. We tell ourselves that because the nation is rooted in particulars of a history, a language, institutions, a religion, a culture, because it's particular, people who come from elsewhere feel aggrieved that they can't immediately share into this. And therefore the nation is illegitimate. The nation produces strife. The only legitimate polity is the supranational polity. So in Britain we now think legitimacy resides not in Britain but in supranational institutions and laws such as the United Nations, the European Union, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, European Court of Human Rights, and so on. And this is part of a drive to destroy and remake the British nation and culture through the doctrine of multiculturalism, the doctrine that says a majority culture is illegitimate because it's rooted in particulars. The only legitimate culture is a multiculture in which all values of minorities must be given equal status to those of the majority. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that is a way of destroying a majority culture. One of the side effects of this is that fact that you can't then integrate immigrants. If you think about it for 2 seconds, if you want to integrate immigrants, and most immigrants, including many Muslims, wish to integrate, they find when they come to Britain there's nothing to integrate into. They find that our institutions, our schools are saying, we celebrate your culture. Your identity is rooted in where you came from. That is your integrity. And we're going to celebrate your culture. Our culture is rubbish. And anyway, it doesn't really exist. So they've got nothing to hang on to. Now, this has had many, many lethal effects. One of the most lethal, in fact, the most lethal, is on young Muslim men who are stranded between cultures for various reasons. And we have made it even more difficult for them to get a handle on something sensible and good to hang on to. But the very worst effect of multiculturalism is what it's done to the idea of truth and lies. It has simply exiled truth and replaced it by lies, by reversing the notion of who is a victim and who is a victimizer. It goes like this. As you probably know, minority rights is a phenomenon in America too. If you are a minority, racial, sexual, religious, ethnic, whatever, you are deemed to be a victim of the majority. This actually doesn't apply to Jews, who are not considered a minority at all, because as we all know, they run America, but put that to one side. If you're any other kind of minority, if you do something terrible, we can all agree the deed is terrible, suicide bombing is terrible, we can all broadly agree with that, apart from 1 or 2 parliamentarians and the Prime Minister's wife. However, we can't hold you as a community responsible or accountable because you are basically the victims of us, and therefore it's basically our fault. Islamophobia, war in Iraq, or whatever it is. Now, this is lethal in respect of this, that it plays directly into the Muslim refusal to accept any responsibility or blame on their part, and to blame their victims instead. And they do this for this reason, that they genuinely believe that their culture, their faith, is under assault by a West which is out to destroy them. They genuinely believe that, and therefore they genuinely believe that what are, objectively speaking, acts of aggression by them, 9/11, 7/7, etc., they genuinely believe these are acts of self-defense. And they genuinely believe that any acts by the West or the free world to defend itself against these objective acts of aggression, America into Afghanistan or Iraq, Israel against the Palestinians, those acts are proof that the West is indeed out to destroy them. Now, this fundamental untruth has created a kind of dialogue of the demented, in which you can't get off the same page. You can't have a dialogue with these people because you're not speaking on the same basis. The problem in Britain is that we don't say this. We don't say, come on, guys, this is completely crazy. We're not having this discussion. We're not going to have your doublethink. We say, yes, we agree, because we've got the same doublethink, this inversion of victim and victimizer. So we deepen the untruth. We act as a kind of echo chamber for the paranoia and the hatred. And this is particularly a problem in Britain because the left, which controls British culture, demonizes the chief victimizers and aggressors of all, America and Israel. So not only is there no challenge to the central Islamist conceit of the big and the little Satan, America and Israel, but this is echoed in mainstream British discourse now, where anti-Americanism is at epidemic proportions and Israel is well on the way to being delegitimized. And this acts as an echo chamber, as I've said, for Muslim prejudice, paranoia, and victimization. This has actually brought together, believe it or not, left and right. The left, we all know, anti-America, pro-third world, Palestinianism is the fashionable cause of choice, so much is obvious. The right in Britain are what we call Middle Britain, which is a kind of equivalent of your red states, come from a very different perspective. They are isolationist. They think the world is a very dangerous place. If we don't hurt them, they won't hurt us. Why are they hurting us? Because we must have done something terrible to them. What terrible thing have we done to them? We look at the BBC every day. We see these pictures of Palestinian houses being destroyed by Israeli bulldozers. Look no further. It's all America's fault. It's America which is supporting Israel. Israel is the cause of the problem because of the suppression of the Palestinians. America is supporting Israel. That's why America got bombed on 9/11. We are now supporting America. That's why we're at threat. That is the argument by Middle Britain, right-wing Britain, and they meet the left like that. There is not a cigarette paper to choose between the discourse of the right and the left on the issues of Iraq, Israel, and America. Britain thinks that Israel is the cause of the problem. That's why we have in Britain now 30s-style appeasement, the demonization and delegitimization of Israel, and resurgent anti-Jewish hatred. And this is fueling a hatred. It was having two terrible effects. It's acting as a lethal echo chamber for Islamist paranoia and violence, and it's fueling a hatred of America and Israel among the non-Muslim population, which is, I think, causing Britain and indeed increasingly the West to falter in the defense of the free world. Because what we're seeing now is a cultural collapse, a collapse of nerve, a collapse of cultural nerve in Britain and in Europe, and I'm afraid I now see it encroaching in America too. The biggest danger of the West is not Islamism, it's not the Islamic Jihad. That is the obvious threat. But the biggest danger to us is the climate of defeatism, appeasement and cultural collapse, which means that we're not able to fight this thing properly. And the root of that problem is this cultural relativism, which is effectively deconstructed truth. So in Britain we have a complete flight from reason and rationality on these issues of Israel, America and Iraq. The crucial point to finish is that this whole thing we conceive as a war on terror or a war against terror. Of course that is correct. We've got to discover and stop the terrorist plots, no question about that. But the bigger war that we are facing is a war of ideas. It is ideas that kill. The Islamists are very, very shrewd and intelligent. They have understood something we find it very difficult to understand. They understand that the people who colonize the world of ideas win this thing. They understand that it's the ideas that are recruiting people to the jihad. These ideas which are based on lies and paranoia of the kind that I've been telling you about today. And these ideas have to be fought publicly. We have to repudiate it. When we find this doublethink, as we find in Britain all the time, we're being told, if you tell us the lie again, that Islam is a religion of violence, we will kill you. And faced with this doublethink, we don't say, this is insane, and this is wrong, and we're not having this, and you are going to conform to our way of thinking, which is basically based on reason, facts, and truth. We are silent. We have left the battleground open We're not being defeated. We're not even fighting because we're not even identifying the ground on which we need to fight. We have to fight these ideas on the battleground of ideas. We have to end this paralysis of doublethink of Islamism. And above all, we have to sort out in our minds the most difficult thing of all. We tell ourselves Islam is a religion. It is. Islam is one of the three great religions of the world: Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Therefore, we say to ourselves, we can't criticize or take on Islam just as we can't criticize or take on Christianity or Judaism, because the state, the public sphere, must keep away from that, otherwise it's oppressive. But we've forgotten one thing, that the deal is that the state does keep away from that. Tolerance in a democracy, a liberal Western democracy, is we have freedom of religion, Jews, Christians, Muslims, freedom of religion in the private sphere. The state, the public sphere keeps away. Fine. The quid pro quo is that the religion makes no demands on the public sphere to correspond to its values. Judaism makes no such demands. Christianity, well, we are indeed a Christian civilization. But basically there is a division between church and state, between synagogue and state. There is no division between mosque and state. So we have to say to the Muslim world, if you wish to live in the West, that's fine by us, provided you play by the rules. The rules are religion is private. You are spiritual, you get spiritual sustenance from Islam, fine by us. Not for us to say whether this is true or not. That's fine by us. But as soon as you make demands on us, as soon as you say we want Sharia law, as soon as you say we want you to change your foreign policy, as soon as you say, whatever you say, the wearing of the veil, I'm afraid I think the wearing of the veil is a political act in the public sphere. This is why it's banned in countries which fear this, Turkey, Tunisia, and there are moves now in the Netherlands to do the same. We say to them, this is not the deal. This is not the deal. If you want to live with us, you live by our rules. The trouble is we've not asserted that. We should assert that, and then we should see what happens. Thank you.
The percentage of Jews who perished in the Netherlands during World War II exceeded that of any country in Western Europe. Fast forwarding to the present, we have a situation where the Dutch state funds with taxpayer money hundreds of mosques and Islamic organizations headed by radical clerics, the new Nazis, who are committed to the destruction of Dutch society. In 2000, the Arab European League was permitted to open its first branch in the Netherlands. The League was founded by a former member of Hezbollah, and it's responsible for inciting riots and anti-Semitic violence in the Netherlands. The organization has praised 9/11. It has called for the destruction of Israel. It's supported the insurgency in Iraq, and it has called for the implementation of Sharia law throughout Europe. We're all familiar with the events surrounding the murder of Theo van Gogh, which happened in Amsterdam. This was a reaction to a film he co-produced with Hersey Ali called Submission. And Submission was a film which criticized the treatment of women under Islam. Recently, the Justice Minister in the Netherlands said that he was ready to institute Sharia law throughout the country as soon as the majority voted it in. Well, here to provide us with some insights into the situation in the Netherlands and an understanding of why the Dutch tolerate this and even abet it is Douglas Murray.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and it's very good to be here with you this weekend. When I talk about jihad and the current war on Islamic fascism, I have a slightly dual role, I find, which is that in Europe I preach and talk pessimism, and in America I preach and talk optimism. And there's a reason for that, which is that it seems to me that the big thing that needs to happen at the moment is that Europeans wake up, but that Americans don't give up on Europe. I say that because Mark Steyn, for instance, has just written a wonderful book, I'm sure many of you have read it, America Alone, which seems again to suggest that Europe is simply gone as a continent, that it's over, that it's so over there. Batior, of course, a great scholar and a great writer, came up with this term Eurabia, which has now gained currency in America, which is, I think, very worrying. People too routinely talk about Eurabia. It is still Europe. And if you start calling it Eurabia, if you believe that this is the case, I do worry that you're going to give up on us. I do worry you're going to give up on the good people of Europe who are still there. So please, avoid that temptation and avoid the schadenfreude of thinking they've mucked up again, we're not going to help, we need you now. The situation in Holland is desperately worrying. There's no doubt about that. Demographics, for one, are against us. More than half of the children in Amsterdam schools are non-Dutch at the moment. Rotterdam is about to have a Muslim majority. The 4 largest cities in the Netherlands are predicted to have Muslim majorities in the next decade. The Dutch government in 2004 released a survey which said that by 2017, the majority of people in Holland would be non-Dutch. As Geert Wilders said, an MP in the Dutch parliament, we will lose our country, it's as simple as that. And when people say, why should we bother? Why should we care about this? It's only Holland or something like this. I would suggest this. Many people, particularly conservatives, like to come up with the phrase, well, at least it won't happen in my lifetime. This will happen in our lifetimes. This isn't a distant future. 11 years, ladies and gentlemen, 11 years till you lose the Netherlands. 2 people who did wake up to this early were Pim Fortuyn and Theo van Gogh, and of course both of them are now dead. There are 2 speeches by both these men which haunt me, really, apart from anything else, because they provided a kind of very saddening prophecy of both of their demise. Pim Fortuyn gave a speech just a few months before his death when he left something called the Liberal Netherlands Party and founded his own party, which in 4 months got a sweeping victory in the elections without, then it was, their leader who was killed shortly before the election. Pim said when he left the Leefbaar Netherlands party, he gave a speech in which he said to his party, he said, I've kept my cool until now, but I won't hold it any longer. He said, it is 5 minutes to 12. It is 5 minutes to 12, not just in the Netherlands, but in all of Europe. That clock is still ticking, but without anything being done, it's just a little closer to midnight. When Theo van Gogh was still alive, just shortly before his death, he made a speech, a characteristic speech of Van Gogh, in which he appeared in Amsterdam dressed as an imam, and he had a strap-on false beard. It was a sort of typically Van Gogh appearance, extremely tasteless but very funny as well, in which, among other things, he said that his so-called conversion to Islam benefited him in 2 ways. He said, first of all, he'd found a religion in which women knew their place. And secondly, he'd found some clothes that fitted. But Van Gogh finished that speech in 2004, shortly before his death, saying, he said, Allah is the scourge which will conquer Amsterdam. Sleep well, good Amsterdammers. The truth is that in the 2 years, or to the month, since Van Gogh was slaughtered on the streets of Amsterdam, the Dutch people and the Amsterdammers have indeed gone back to sleep. Largely a political problem, largely the fact that the right in Holland has split without a leader since Fortuyn's death. They don't know who to back, where to go, turnout's been dropping, and the parties that do exist, such as Wilders' party, have split and find no coherent voice. At the moment, as you also know, there are a set of private tragedies going on from Holland. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you'll know of course, no longer lives in Holland. One of the immigrants that Holland needed most left. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, of course, now living in Washington. Geert Wilders, her fellow MP, lives under constant armed guard. When he drives out, 2 motorcades go out, 1 decoy wherever he drives. He can't campaign. There's an election in Holland this week. Two of his supporters only 2 weeks ago were beaten up by Moroccans in Amsterdam putting up posters. The process of democracy, in other words, is becoming exceedingly dangerous. Young Dutch supporters of Wilders will not stand for his party, not because they don't support him and not because they don't have guts, but because they will have to have security protection for the rest of their lives if they stand as a candidate. That's a large amount to ask of a young man or woman starting out in a political career. A friend of mine, Bart-Jan Splat, a head of the only conservative think tank in Holland, the Burke Institute, it's a wonderful organization set up a few years ago, was told shortly before Van Gogh's death by the police in Holland that he should take protection. He said, well, if I need protection, why will you not protect me? And he said, well, they said, well, there isn't enough money. But they suggested he paid for it himself at the cost of €100 an hour, which, as you'll know, there's not that kind of money in think tanks. So he went without protection until an hour after Van Gogh's death, when the police were at his house and whisked him away and gave him protection since. Afshin Elian, a great friend of mine, and one of the great philosophers, I think, of Europe now, fled the Ayatollah Khomeini as a young man, fled to Afghanistan, where he then fled the Taliban, and landed up in Holland, where he currently teaches at the University of Leiden, teaches law and philosophy, and he lives now under death sentence in Holland. Having fled theo-fascism all his life, he's now encountered its worst form in Holland, where security guards sit on campus with him, the campus is searched for bombs every morning. Again, this is no life, and all that he has done is write newspaper columns fortnightly for the main conservative newspaper. There are people who have stopped because they are so scared of what's going to happen. I know of journalists and others who've simply stopped talking about Islam. In one case, he went on television to read out his last newspaper column and said, leave me alone, I won't talk about Islam, I'll just continue teaching, don't hurt me. This is spreading across Europe, which is why it's important to tackle it now there. In Denmark, only a couple of weeks ago, we all have heard of the cartoons catastrophe, and incidentally, those people who tell you that, and you hear them a lot, that there was something provocative about that. We should do the thought test. What could you do if you wanted to make a criticism of something that would be smaller than drawing a cartoon? Those people who say that we should have no truck with. But in Holland and Denmark, cartoons at the moment matter. 2 weeks ago, a group of Danish school kids went on a kind of scout camp thing, and demonstrating that humour isn't dead among the young of Denmark, had their own mini cartoon competition. Footage of this, filmed by someone, seems to be an infiltrator from another political organisation, filmed this and passed it to one of the main imams in Denmark, who's just condemned by fatwa these young boys to death. Some of us are currently working at a fund to try to protect them, and I'd very gladly pass on details if you're interested afterwards. In Belgium, one of the MPs, Murat Boussakla, lives under death sentence, lives under protection. The AEL, which was mentioned just now in 2002, had effectively a Kristallnacht imitation pogrom in Antwerp, in which the head of the AEL, the thug and Hezbollah trainee Dayed Abu Jaja, led chants in support of Osama bin Laden, the smashing up of Jewish-owned shops, and then culminating in the chant Hamas, Hamas, Allah Joden on het gas. Hamas, Hamas, all Jews to the gas. If we don't recognize these echoes now, I don't know when we will. In France, just a few weeks ago, as you'll know, Redica, a schoolteacher, has had to go into hiding after writing an article critical of Islam. 2 weeks ago, a German MP who spoke out, a Turkish immigrant MP who spoke out against the veil, was given death threats and now lives under armed guard and in secure accommodation. The truth is, this is simply spreading. It's even the case sometimes in the UK. I was invited by the left-leaning newspaper The Guardian to write an article the other week explaining why I still support the Iraq War, the bafflement and amazement they feel that needs them to commission such articles was evident, and in response just to that, among other things, there were suggestions posted up on the Guardian website that I should be beheaded. One post said that I should be beheaded because only if I was beheaded would there be peace. I think it's a new movement, pacifists for beheading. But I showed a I showed Submission, the Iron Solitaire Van Gogh film, in public for the first time to a group of MPs, peers and others a couple of weeks ago, and had armed guards for that. So sadly it's spreading, but there's no reason why we should step down, or why we should be quieter, or why we should stop. The mosque, which Melanie just mentioned, the Tablighi mosque, the Tablighi have a metaphor for how they're going to spread. They say that they put out the tentacles into Europe. They will put out the leads of all these light bulbs across Europe. All the strands will go out, and then Allah will turn on the lights. I suggest to you that if that light and those lights start to come on, the light of Europe will go out. But Europe is reawakening, and this is why I say do not be pessimists, do not sign up for Schadenfreude, and do not abandon this. There are many movements in Europe at the moment, political and literary, to stop this. Just in the last few months, there's a new magazine started up in France, a superb magazine countering this, called Le Demandement. Do get it. Pinio, a new Dutch magazine starting up next month in Holland. There's a new publishing house in Italy, new newspapers in Italy. Across Europe, there is a strong and I hope more and more connected movement of MPs, representatives, journalists and others who are standing up to this threat. And they are saying without any compunction, and bravely I think in many of their cases, if you want Sharia law, you can go and have it, but it will not be here. It will not be in our lands. We have to be better at giving out that message, and I hope that you Americans will continue to support us as we say these things. The UK, my own country, has in recent years, as you know, stood absolutely shoulder to shoulder with your country, and our troops fight daily beside yours in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the British government and many of the British people are very proud of that. And it reminds me of, I'll finish here, but it reminds me of one of my favorite stories, really, of one of the greatest men, Winston Churchill, who in 1940, when Britain was still standing alone against the threat of fascism last time, Churchill invited the American ambassador to the court of St. James to discuss your country providing provisions to Britain in our darkest hour. And Winston Churchill, over a whole course of a weekend, persuaded your ambassador that he should give provision, military and so on, to Britain. And at the end of the weekend, when the ambassador was flying back to see the president that night, and he said to Churchill, I wonder if you'd be interested in knowing what I'm going to say to the president. And Churchill agreed that he would like to know. And the ambassador simply quoted from the second book of Ruth, the first book of Ruth, the second chapter, I'm sorry, and just said to Winston Churchill then, he said, this is what I'm going to say. He said, whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I shall lodge also, and thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. And then he added, even to the end. You kept that pact then. We've kept it in the last 5 years. And I hope that you'll find it to continue keeping that pact in the years ahead. Thank you.